than I do. It's absolutely true that your great-grandparents were individually more intelligent and had faster reaction times than today because they're in a process of steady decay. Now, God knows that. Hello? Come on, folks. God has never had a V8 moment. Right? I mean, God has never said, why not think of that? Right? So he knows that human sin is going to cause this decay. And the truth is, we ought not to even be here. But we are here, correct? Now, why are we here? Because God put 7 little engines, I'll call them, pre-programmed into the 3 billion bits of information in your DNA. And these little engines almost never break. And they spend all day going up and down your chromosomes correcting the minor mistakes that are made every day. And if it were not for that, you wouldn't be here. This also tells us, and I realize that you may not understand the genetics of it, but it also tells us that the Lord's coming back soon. I'm not naming a date. I'm just simply saying he's coming back soon. Because this process continues for much longer, and there won't be a human race. We'll have lost so much genetic information that we can't exist. But God put those little engines in there to correct the minor mistakes. Now, it will not correct the big mistakes like hemophilia, sickle cell anemia, and so on, but it does correct a lot of the little mistakes that occur every single day. Okay, I'll try this one. Ain't God good? Amen. I got a little response there. Okay. Well, what else? I mean, that's just number one. This is a rendering of showing Earth's magnetic field. When you were in school, everybody learned about the magnetic field of the Earth and compasses and needles pointing north and south. I mean, just keep it simple. But the Earth's magnetic field, since the time of creation, it's decaying. Because of human sin, everything is in a state of decay, and that includes the Earth's magnetic field. It's getting weaker and weaker every single day. And we've been able to measure this for 200 years. So we know that every 1,400 years, the magnetic field drops by 50% of what it was previously. So every 1,400 years, you get half, half, half. And, well, since we've been able to measure it for 200 years, we know that we have actually lost 95% of the magnetic field since the creation 6,000 years ago. Now, in my book, I do give the research on this, but we know that an intense magnetic field from conception to puberty will help to stabilize the chromosomes. So looking around the room, I guess it's too late for any of you. But we do know that to be true by laboratory experiment. Now, if the Earth's magnetic field was really 20 times what it is today, that would help to stabilize the chromosomes and you would live longer. Are you with me so far here? Yeah. But the Earth's magnetic field has more than one effect on our longevity. You're going to find out that some things have 2, 3 benefits. It's not just one. And so, for example, this is an illustration of the Earth's magnetosphere. The Earth has this magnetic field, and it's kind of round on one side, but it trails off on the back side. But this is called the magnetosphere, but it's because of the Earth's magnetic field. Now, this is an illustration that deadly radiation comes from mostly the sun. There's some galactic radiation, but it's mostly solar. And that deadly radiation is ionized, meaning it's plus or minus charged, and it comes from the sun and hits the Earth, except for our magnetic field. Because it's plus or minus charged, what happens is when this deadly radiation hits the magnetosphere, the Earth's magnetic field, it actually curves and comes in at the North Pole and the South Pole, where so few people live. Come on, isn't that a good design? I mean, think about it for just a second. We are the only planet in the solar system that has a magnetic field that lines up with our axis of rotation. There are planets that have no magnetic field. There are planets, we have one planet, that has a magnetic field, rotation, and axis of the field that's 60 degrees off. Now, if that were the Earth, all that deadly radiation would drop in along the tropics where most people live today. And we'd have a dead zone. So you see, this really is good design, right? And of course, this deadly radiation is also pretty. It's what causes the northern and southern lights, the aurora australis and the aurora borealis. And it's really pretty, but it's also deadly radiation. I have not been able to go back to Russia for 2 years as of this weekend. This marks the 2-year anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine. And I left 2 days before the invasion. I have not been able to go back. But I worked many years north of the Arctic Circle, where you could see, well, the aurora borealis. And about 15 years ago, I lost a friend. She was 38 years old, the wife of a pastor with 4 children. She died of cancer because she'd lived under that deadly radiation all her life. So you have to know there are consequences of these things, correct? And looking around the room, there are many of you, I'm not going to say all, but there are many of you that can remember the American space program when we decided to go to the moon, right? I mean, you can remember that, right? What is the reason we retire our astronauts early? What is the reason we don't leave people in space for real long periods of time? Well, the worst thing about space is not weightlessness, it's not water, it's not oxygen. The worst thing about space is radiation. Space is a very deadly place, and shielding astronauts and so forth is a big problem. And we retire our astronauts relatively early because they've been exposed to so much radiation. But how many of you do remember the space program back in the 60s? And do you remember the words, the Van Allen radiation belts? Van Allen radiation belts. So the big thing was, of course, we were learning how to go to the moon, and we blew up some really bad rockets. Finally got a good rocket, and we started launching people up into orbit and so forth. But the problem is, well, we were launching them up through the Van Allen radiation belts. Now, in those days, we knew of 2. Today, we know there's actually 3. There's a weak third one. But this is deadly radiation. And, well, think with me. Today, the magnetic field of the Earth is only 5% the strength of what it was 6,000 years ago. And, well, if you go back 6,000 years, it's 20 times stronger. That's going to push the radiation farther out into space before it gets to the Earth. You with me? And so very little of it's going to leak through. But today, because the field has shrunk by 95%, more and more of it's leaking through. This is not the only reason, but consider for just a moment, I'm sure you've all noticed that cancer rates are pretty much going straight up. This is not the only reason. I don't want you to think it is. But it's a contributing factor to that. Are you with me? So another reason that we would have lived longer was, if you lived on Earth back in those days, the magnetic field would have not only stabilized chromosomes, but it would have also protected you much better from this deadly radiation. And remember in Genesis chapter 1, verse 7, God makes the waters above, the waters below, correct? Now, the waters above, it's not cloud. The Earth never had a 100% cloud cover. There's only one planet in the solar system that has a 100% cloud cover, and that's Venus. And just for your benefit, I can assure you with absolute certainty we are never going to land a human being on Venus. If you don't understand quite why, first of all, the clouds are made out of sulfuric acid. That's a good reason. But Venus is the brightest object in the sky after the moon when it's visible. And that nice little sort of bluish dot in the sky, but because it has 100% cloud cover, traps heat. I mean, I know that you know right here, if you have a cloudy night, it doesn't get as cold as a clear night, right? Because of the radiation of heat out. But the radiation goes in through the clouds in Venus. The heat builds up. The temperature on the surface of Venus is approximately 850 degrees Fahrenheit. That's why we're never going to go there. I mean, if it were possible to stand on the surface of Venus and you had a pound of lead in your hand, it would melt in your hand. Hello? We ain't never going there. But so when it says the waters above, we're not talking about clouds. What we're talking about is extra moisture, humidity. We weren't there, we didn't measure it, but let's just say 5-10% more moisture in the air kind of thing. And I realize in Alabama it's hard to think of there being an extra 5 or 10% more moisture in the air, but boy, come on, I live in Florida. You want to talk about humidity. But it is moisture, or we call it water vapor. You could see through it. You would have been able to see the sun, the moon, probably Venus at least, maybe Mars and so forth, but maybe as many as 10,000 star points bright enough to see through this moisture. But this moisture diffuses the light. And so you would only see maybe 10,000 star points, maybe a few planets, but you would have seen the rest of the universe. And I always like to challenge people to think about this. Think about yourself for just a moment being in the ark with Noah. We're going to talk about the ark of Noah. But think about being in the ark with the family after the 40 days and 40 nights of rain, when much of that extra moisture came down. And because of that, the family looked up at night and saw the Milky Way for the first time in human history. I think that would have been rather spectacular, don't you? So this moisture, however, has multiple benefits. Just the extra humidity in the air. For example, there would be no seasons. I mean, think about it. Seasons didn't begin until Genesis 8:22, after the flood. There was no spring and summer, fall, and winter. Now, believe me, I know much about Alabama. My wife's folks lived up in Fort Payne for a long time and visited this area many, many times. What is the single biggest problem that a farmer faces in Alabama? Well, it's not rain and so forth, and so isn't the biggest problem for a farmer here crop failure? Because if you miss one crop here in Alabama, you got to wait a whole year for the next one. Is that correct? Oh. Well, think with me for a moment. Before the flood, there were no seasons. You would have to work because of human sin. You'd have to toil, but think with me. You could grow a crop, cut it down, harvest it, plant the next day. What would life be like if you could just continuously grow food? I mean, down in Florida, we grow corn twice a year. We can grow it 3 times a year. It's just not economical. Because in the spring, we harvest ours in April, May, and we ship it north because you are willing to pay the freight. You'd like to have some fresh corn. But in the summer, you more or less you got your own. But in the fall, we harvest again in October because you got really used to having fresh corn and you ran out of yours, so now you're willing to pay to get ours up out of Florida. Hello? I'm serious. In Florida, we can grow radishes on a 28-day rotation. Imagine the food not being a problem, no crop failures and so forth, no stress in the sense of crop failures. So you'd probably live a lot longer that way too, right? Well, again, this higher humidity that's surrounding the earth, again, has multiple benefits. Another benefit is it would help to reduce UV radiation. Now, looking around the room here, I can tell that some of you all do remember when men had barbers and ladies had hair salons. All right? Remember back for just a moment. Do you remember back? And the men and women that were doing hair used the same combs and the same scissors from client to client. But in between uses, they had a little box on the counter with 5 sides and 5 mirrors, one side open. And inside was a little blue light. Anybody here remember those? I do. Okay, several people agree. So I have a witness, right? Now, why did we do that? That little blue light in there was an ultraviolet lamp. Ultraviolet light kills living organisms. And to prevent lice and bacteria being transferred from one client to the next, they used to put the combs and the scissors in that little box, sterilize them. Excellent methodology. We don't do it today. Today we use disposables and chemicals. And why is that? I really hope you're listening, because ultraviolet light causes cataracts. And if you want to delay cataract development in your own body, you want to be sure that every single day of the year, I don't care what day it is, every day of the year here, you should be wearing sunglasses with blue blocker. if you want to prolong cataract development. Because the reason we don't do that anymore is because the men and women were getting cataracts much earlier than the average population. And so now we have to use disposables and chemicals. How are you all doing so far? I mean, is this good for you? Okay. Now, before the flood, as far as we know, there was no real volcanic or earthquake activity. Now remember, volcanoes do not cause earthquakes. Earthquakes cause volcanoes. But today, volcanoes don't kill very many people. I think you would agree. Although tonight we're going to talk about Mount St. Helens. Sunday morning, May the 18th, 1980, and killed 57 people. Now, they died from terminal stupidity. I'm just telling it like it is, folks. They were told not to be there, and they chose to be, right? So they died of terminal stupidity. I would point out to you, though, the volcano erupted, and it went north, parallel to the ground, and killed 57 people. If it had gone west and done the same thing, it would have killed 50,000. But today, not very many people die from earthquakes because, from volcanoes, because as they are starting to develop and getting ready to blow up, you get more and more earthquakes. We know that, so we know that it's getting dangerous, and we get people out. But how many people still die from earthquakes today? How many of you have gotten up to go to church on a Sunday morning, turned on the radio, the TV, and you heard about an earthquake, let's say in Pakistan, somewhere in that area, and 10,000 people died that morning because their houses fell in on them? So a lot of people still die from earthquakes today, right? But today, we don't kill a lot of people with volcanoes. But let's go back 2,000 years. What about Vesuvius in the year 79? I mean, I visited Pompeii and Herculaneum. There's marvelous places to visit, but tens of thousands of people all died because of this eruption, correct? Well, before the flood, as far as we know, there was no significant earthquake or volcanic activity, and without that, you'd probably live longer, correct? You see how if you start putting things together, and then, of course, let's talk about pollution. Now, I hate to point this out. I absolutely hate environmental terrorists. The Green Movement and so on. I hate them because it's a political agenda. It's not science at all. It's anti-science. But when I was an evolutionist growing up in California, they told me as a child that the solution to pollution was dilution. That we're going to throw all of our waste in the air, in the ground, in the water, and that would take care of our pollution. Of course, today we can think about it quite differently. As good Christian stewards, the solution to pollution is prevention, right? But people forget, nature is not pristine. Because of human sin, nature is not pristine. Nature pollutes. Now, basically the biggest polluter in nature are volcanoes. Some of you might remember 1991, Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines. It dumped between 20 and 30 million tons of aerosols and particulates into the atmosphere and polluted the atmosphere more in 1 year from one volcano than all humans that year. Another thing, too, you've heard about ozone. Maybe you've heard about a problem with ozone and ozone being destroyed. Actually, it's not a problem at all. It's temporary. It doesn't go all the way through the atmosphere. It just fills right back in after a few weeks. But the chemicals that destroy ozone in the upper atmosphere, bromine, fluorine, chlorine. And we had to get rid of, various refrigerants and all kinds of stuff because of those chemicals were involved. So we got rid of really good and efficient chemicals to replace them with less efficient, more costly, and more corrosive chemicals. Just thought y'all know. But plants, one-celled plants in the oceans destroy more ozone than all the people on Earth in 1 year. Now, I have a question for you. Knowing that, would you want to kill the single-celled plant organisms in the ocean that get rid of more ozone than anything else? Okay, you say no, but do you know why? Well, let me point out to you, those little single-celled organisms in the ocean produce more oxygen than all the plants on the dry land. I don't know about you, I like breathing. Hello? So I don't think I want to get rid of them, do you? And besides that, it's not a problem. There is no such thing as an ozone hole. It's an ozone depleted area, but it's like the bottom of a saucer. It doesn't go all the way through, and it fills right back in. It's not a big deal. Well, nature does pollute. Dust storms, forest fires, all kinds of pollution. There's a power plant in Florida between Orlando and Tampa right next to I-4 that I travel frequently, and I've lived there for 50 years. I remember when it was built. Today, because of environmental terrorists, that plant has to put out air cleaner than it takes in. So you are paying to vacuum the atmosphere. I just thought you ought to know. Well, what additional things were different? I mean, I was just talking about the science. What about the medicine? Okay? So what else is different? Well, first of all, God gave people a perfect diet. Genesis chapter 1, 29 and 30. God made all the creatures as vegetarians, which includes T-Rex, velociraptors, and oviraptors. I would like to point that out. Monday we're going to do a presentation on people and dinosaurs really did live together, and we can prove it. But even T-Rexes, velociraptors, oviraptors have been reclassified by evolutionists as being vegetarians. That has to do with their dentition. It has to do with, we found fossil material that they'd eaten, and it's all vegetable. They were not meat eaters. Remember, never, ever get your education from National Geographic or Hollywood. Right. I should have had a bigger amen there. I'll try it again. Okay. Never, ever get your education from National Geographic or Hollywood. 22 years ago, evolutionists reclassified those reptiles as vegetarian. But when did they start teaching that in school? Hello? Well, I am, and I talked with the pastor about this just yesterday, I am eternally grateful, however, for Genesis 9:3. If you're not familiar with Genesis 9:3, after the flood, God says, now you shall eat meat, for which I am eternally grateful. Hello? I am a meativore. Hello? Yeah. Not that you shouldn't have just a balanced diet, but I favor meat. You know, there's enough room in this world for me and wildlife as long as it's next to my plate. So, but what else? Well, humans and animals, they were vegetarian initially because, think with me, the plants were perfect initially. They provided all, remember, God says, I give you the plant, they shall be as like similar to meat to your body. That's in Genesis chapter 1. And then after the flood, he says, now I give you, meat, it shall, and I give it to you in the same way that I gave you the green plant. And so, again, it has to do with nutrition. Now, think with me. Why did we used to live to be 900? We had a perfect immune system. Think about that. You couldn't get sick. And you had a perfect digestive system initially. And God gave us a perfect food, which had all the nutrients and so forth that we would need in the vegetation. But even evolutionists would agree that upwards of 90 to 95% of all plants that have ever existed on this planet are now extinct. So many of the plants before the flood, we could have eaten, gotten everything we needed out of it. Didn't need meat particularly. But because they became extinct and because they are decaying also and are not as nutritious, then what's happening? Well, now you have to supplement meat to get the amino acids that the plants can't give you. And remember I mentioned that higher humidity up above. I said it has multiple benefits, correct? Now, it helps to filter out ultraviolet light. That's the first one. But wouldn't you agree with me here on a really rainy day, foggy day, doesn't the air just feel heavier? Right? I mean, it does just feels heavier. Right? And that's because it is heavier. You take a dry cubic foot of air and you start pumping moisture into it to the point of saturation, and that cubic foot of air gets heavier, right? Now, we had all that extra moisture up there at the time of creation. It came down basically in the rain after the time of the flood. But we had all that moisture up there, and well, what's that going to do? It's going to make the air up there heavier. So what's that going to do to the pressure on the surface of the earth down here? Well, it's going to increase the pressure. Now, we were not there. We didn't have scientific instruments back there, but our best estimates are 1.2 to 2.2, I'm sorry, 1.6 to 2.2 times the pressure of today. So we were living in a higher pressure from creation to the flood. What benefits would that have? Well, we know it's true because of, for instance, air bubbles trapped in amber. By the way, amber only forms underwater. Now, what is going to cause insects and small creatures and so forth to be trapped in amber if that can only happen underwater? Kind of speaks of a worldwide flood, doesn't it? Yeah. Uh-huh. But because of that, and remember that insects don't have nostrils, they don't have lungs the way we do. Insects actually breathe through little tiny holes on the side of their body called spiracles, and the size of an insect is not dependent upon how long it lives. The size of an insect is dependent upon how much oxygen it gets while it's alive. Now, I am not at all concerned about quoting evolutionists, and I'm about to quote some evolutionists. I'm a creationist, but I'll quote evolutionists because they find lots of stuff that supports creation. They just don't know it. So, for example, an oxygen-rich atmosphere allowed gigantic insects to grow 300 million supposed years ago. Dragonflies with wingspans up to 36 inches flourished in the Carboniferous period, supposedly 300 to 360 million years ago. Evolutionary believing researchers had long suspected that the giant insects and the lush forests needed more oxygen than the 21% level today. That comes from an evolutionary source, but I quote from another one. Plants and marine life preferentially take up certain isotopes of carbon and sulfur, and their absorption changes as the concentration of oxygen rises. Analysis of these isotopes in ancient rocks shows that oxygen content in the atmosphere peaked at 35% oxygen between roughly 250 and 350 million supposed years ago. No, it didn't peak at 35%. What they're not thinking about is the samples they're taking got there under double pressure. And that's why they're looking at it that way. Because if it was 35% and you light a match, you'd start a forest fire. So it wasn't that high. And again, this is from Time magazine. All the way back in 1987, air bubbles trapped in amber, 50% more oxygen. North Carolina State University. This is a very vitriolic evolutionary publication, New Scientist. But North Carolina State University is a secular university. No question about that, right? But they did some research that is really interesting. They took ginkgo plants raised in an artificial atmosphere 5 times the carbon dioxide, 1.5 times the oxygen of today. That's the atmosphere they think existed back in the Cretaceous period, but the plants grew 3 times faster than today. We should not be sequestering CO2. This whole idea of you got to have a smaller carbon footprint, that's a joke. The fact of the matter is we really ought to be releasing everything we've sequestered because the plants would just absorb it. And tell me something, what do plants use to make food? Come on, folks, that's a kind of a give me. It was carbon dioxide. And what do trees use to make wood? Carbon dioxide. By sequestering carbon dioxide with a growing population, we're now at 8 billion, we're actually starving people to death by the millions. We ought to just release it. Nature would take care of it, no problem whatsoever. Well, I don't want to disturb anybody. Maybe you had breakfast before you came, but these are human red blood cells. Now, why am I showing you that? Well, you know that red blood cells carry oxygen in and take carbon dioxide out of the body. You're all well aware of that. However, if you double the pressure, it isn't just the cells, it's the whole fluid, the serum, that carries oxygen in and carbon dioxide out. So if you had a double atmospheric pressure, you'd have a lot more oxygen in your available in your body. When Adam was told to tend a garden that goes from Damascus to Egypt, he couldn't run a marathon without getting winded. Hello? And I hate bringing up negative things here in Sunday school, but how many of you remember the Sago coal mine accident back in 2006? 13 miners were trapped underground up in West Virginia. 12 died from carbon monoxide poisoning. Mr. McCloy survived. First, he was in a different part of the mine. However, when we found him, he was about to die from carbon monoxide poisoning. Why do you die from carbon monoxide poisoning? You actually die from asphyxiation. And the reason is that the hemoglobin in your red blood cells likes carbon monoxide more than it likes oxygen and carbon dioxide. So you breathe carbon monoxide in, it gets into your red blood cells, and it won't come out. And so the blood cells can't take oxygen in and carbon dioxide out. There's no room. And you die from asphyxiation. Now, he was almost dead when we found him. When we found him, we slapped pure oxygen on his face, evacuated him out to a hospital, and we put him in one of those, a hyperbaric chamber. Hyperbaric meaning extra pressure. And we put him in 100% oxygen, twice the pressure of the atmosphere, and just pumped oxygen in, because every second you are sitting right there, your body is making millions of new red blood cells. Every second, it's getting rid of old blood cells by the millions. And if we can keep you alive long enough that your body gets rid of the contaminated ones and you generate enough new cells to carry the oxygen in for yourself, then we can take you out. Y'all with me so far? Well, I know I have to finish here because we're running out of time, but I would just like to add a couple of things here. What's the benefit of hyperbaric oxygen? Well, oxygen causes healing. And in Germany, we're treating stroke patients. In England, MS. In France, arthritis, vascular necrosis, sclerosis of the liver, other advanced liver diseases. And I want to point out to you transplant surgeries. I don't want to disturb anybody again, but I am going to show you a lady from France. I will not show you what she looked like before the accident, but I do want to show you what she looked like after she had her face transplanted. Did you hear that? We would never have attempted to transplant a face off of a cadaver if it were not for hyperbaric oxygen. We know how to do the microsurgery. We can put things back together. The problem is keeping oxygen circulating in the tissue until natural circulation is regenerated. Now, on the left, November 2005, she's had the surgery, but you can see the line right here where half of her face was cut off and replaced. And this is only February, 3 months later, it took. She died about 3 years ago from natural causes, but she lived many years with somebody else's face. Hello? And hyperbaric oxygen also, sudden deafness, blindness, Berger's disease, gangrene, reimplants of total extremities. In India, leprosy. Leprosy is a disease similar to diabetic nephritis. And here, well, this is a cerebral palsy patient. It works quite well with some, not all, but it does help some. Helps to reduce nausea from anesthesia and surgery. My wife has a problem with that. And here's one. And notice this is all the way back 22 years ago. Again, autism and other disorders. That's a very early hyperbaric chamber. You can see it's not nearly sophisticated as the ones we use today. But I want to point out, this is a single chamber that you can sit in. Michael Jackson had one of these in his home to keep his nose on. I'm serious as a heart attack. His nose had had so many surgeries, there was literally nothing holding it on. And he had to have one of these in his home to keep his nose on. Professional teams and the larger collegiate teams like Alabama and Auburn and so forth, but all of them have hyperbaric chambers because the athletes will heal twice as fast from minor injuries. Imagine before the flood, you were living in a hyperbaric chamber. You were walking around in a hyperbaric chamber. If you had broken a leg, it would heal in 3 to 4 weeks instead of 6 to 8. But I just want to get one more slide, folks. What other benefits are there of this extra atmospheric pressure? Well, it would restore memory. Anybody here in favor of that? Yeah, I thought so. Or it will increase energy. Anybody here in favor of that? Okay, you're really going to like the next one. It would restore zest to older men and women. I got some amens at least. And, of course, it reduces the time for healing like burns. This is where hyperbaric oxygen was really first used. But I've taken 4 extra minutes. There's a lot more. We have the video on this material. There's a chapter in my book on this material if you want all the other reasons. But 19 reasons, medical and scientific, which taken in combination would have allowed people to live 900 years. You don't have to let the world determine, what you do and don't believe. You really can defend this position when people challenge you. And you need this kind of information when people challenge you. Could I get an amen on that? Amen. Well, thank you very much. I will be back at the book table if I can help at all. Pastor, you want to close us out real quick?
If you appreciate that this morning, say amen. Amen. Well, he'll be back in just a moment. We're going to have a word of prayer.